I'm going to go ahead and get this kicked off. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Lean, and I am the Director of Partnerships at ADCOLOR. Thank you for joining us today and for committing time to this workshop. We're all super busy, so thank you for making the time. I'm excited to have Citi and Getty Images here today to walk you through the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Imagery Toolkit that they've created to help marketers and communicators create authentic and multifaceted depictions of people in their marketing and communications efforts. I am so happy that our great ADCOLOR partners are creating these types of tools and resources to make our creative work more diverse and inclusive within and outside of their walls. They're sharing it with us, and we couldn't be happier. That's exactly what we really cheer for at ADCOLOR. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Nikki Darden, who is the head of Global Marketing Integration, DEI Strategy, Purpose Marketing, and Internal Brand Engagement at Citi, and Tristen Norman, who is the Director of Creative Insights at Getty. Welcome, Nikki and Tristen.
Thank you, Anna. You know, there's always the couple seconds it takes to get off of mute after I realize I'm still on mute. So thank you everyone for joining. I'm glad you could take a few minutes out of your day to join us today. So our goal today really is to introduce you to a tool that we created, Citi created in partnership with Getty Images, called the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Imagery Toolkit. This toolkit explores the nuances of DEI in the US. That's what we're going to cover today, as well as other countries around the world. We'll talk a little bit about that, and offers guidance on how we can embed these learnings into our creative work. So we believe that when we educate our teams and other organizations about how to embed diversity and really celebrate it, we move the culture forward. So as we're talking about imagery, of course, it made sense for us to partner with Getty Images, the leading global imagery company that provides stock and custom assets for organizations. And in a few moments, Tristen Norman from Getty will walk you through some highlights of the toolkit to help equip you with real marketing insights and tangible ways to drive authentic and multifaceted depictions of people in your marketing and communications. Now, on the bottom of your screen, you will see a QR code. That code links to the toolkit itself, where you can download it. You'll see the markets that are live today, the US, UK, and Mexico, and we've got several more to come. If you'll go to the next slide. So we can talk a quick minute about how this work came about. So my team at Citi does a few different things, but two of the things that we look after are global marketing integration and DEI strategy. And having those two lenses, we had the opportunity to see creative from around the world, teams around the globe. And through that work, we saw a universal opportunity to be more expansive in how we're defining diversity and to become more inclusive in our imagery. So when we partner with Getty, we also partner with research firm Kantar to take a deep dive into the local landscape of our major markets, covering population demographics, trends in imagery, areas of diversity that are often missing in imagery, and opportunities to combat stereotypes to drive more inclusive representation. And we're hosting events like the one we're on today that are really training sessions to just orient people to the toolkit so you can understand how to incorporate these insights in an actionable way so that we can all be more inclusive marketers. As I mentioned, this is not just about the US. We did launch the US first in October of last year. This January, we launched our toolkit in the UK. And this month, we launched Mexico. And we're going to be building toolkits across 9 additional countries across the Americas, EMEA, and Asia Pacific. Because diversity in Mexico is not the same as diversity in the US, is not the same as diversity in Hong Kong. So we need to look at multiple markets to really get a full picture. So before we jump into the workshop, just one final word about the toolkit and how to use it. The toolkit does not have all the answers. Instead, it serves as a roadmap to guide us to incorporate authentic and multifaceted depictions of people in advertising, marketing, communications, creative assets, while also identifying biases and stereotypes through specific lenses of identity. So throughout this body of work, we defined 8 lenses of identity, covering race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, bodies, religion, and socioeconomic status, to show the breadth of what diversity means and the lenses that each of us possess. We'll talk about visual dynamics or stereotypes that often persist in representing each aspect of identity, and introduce questions that we can ask ourselves in order to show more diversity in our work. I just had a brain moment where I think it's from Love Jones, where there's a comment about I don't have all the answers, just all the questions. That's what this is going to do. Okay. Listen, when there's an opportunity to talk about Love Jones, I have to take it.
You gotta take it.
Got to take it. So today we're going to talk about 3 of the 8 lenses. We're going to talk about race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability. And we chose these 3. All of them, of course, are important, but there's so much opportunity in just these 3 to drive increased diversity and authentic visual representation in our work. So we thought these were a good 3 to sort of start with in order to orient you. So after each lens, we're going to have some visual exercises that Tristen's going to walk you through to help gauge your perspective on the content represented. I encourage you to speak up and share your thoughts. There are a lot of us on this call. We don't have a chat function because we work at a bank, and that's how banks do. But just hit the raise hand function to raise your hand. And we've got a lot of folks limited on time, but we'll try to answer or engage as much as possible live on the call. So no chat. You got to actually talk. So with that, I am delighted to welcome Tristen Norman, the Director of Creative Insights at Getty Images. Welcome, Tristen.
Thanks, Nikki. I mean, that Love Jones reference is exactly why I love having panels, discussions, fireside chats with my good friend, Nikki Darden, because she's incredible. Hi, everyone. As Nikki said, I am Tristen Norman. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the head of creative insights for the Americas at Getty Images. One of the really important reasons why we wanted to partner with Citi on this work is because we believe that if you change the image, you can change perceptions. Visuals have such a profound impact on, the way that we see the world, what we deem and prize as important, who we think are beautiful, who we think we should be aspiring to. And often that visuals and, across different media, advertising, film, television, magazines, etc., have always historically upheld certain ideas about what has been prized being as beautiful, based, or important because of systems of oppression. And so we want to use our platform for good to kind of break those things down. And we're pushing for change because we know that change is necessary and can have a profound impact on the world. At the center of the TOOLKIT project, was what we're calling actionable insights. We at Getty Images have access to so much data. We get billions of searches on our site, hundreds of millions of downloads. And these are represented by hundreds of thousands of brands and some of the biggest brands in the world, including the Citibank, for example. And so what we want to use is to identify patterns in those changes, and because that can tell us what's happening in the visual landscape more broadly. And we combined our data with the consumer perspective through our visual GPS research, which really gives us a deeper sense and a more defined sense of how these forces, how these changes are resonating, and what are motivating consumers behind these forces in our world. And we combine that with Kantar's research on the different individual markets to help really answer important questions about that market so that we can understand, here's what's going on, here's what needs to change, and here are the questions you want to ask yourself to make that change. And like Nikki said, it is a roadmap, it is a starting point. So how the workshop will work is we will look at the 3 lenses of identity that Nikki mentioned: race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability. And what we are going to do is look at all of the insights. We're going to actually go into the toolkit, because I imagine that a lot of you haven't had a chance to go through the toolkit yourselves. And so we'll kind of talk through those insights that we uncovered through our research. And what we're going to do also is identify those gaps and what are those things that are missing in terms of that lens of identity, and help you highlight some questions to ask yourself as you think about representing those lenses of identity in your work. And finally, and I think the most important and most fun part, is how we can apply those learnings through real world activities. And so we'll spend some time doing some exercises together. There are 2 exercises. The first exercise will be an image comparison, where we'll just take 2 images and you can share through our polling function which image you think is most impactful based on everything that you've learned or thought about. And then the second activity is a discussion about a single image. And again, bringing all those learnings together, bringing even your background and the work that you are working on day to day, to help us understand if you think that this is an appropriate or authentic representation of that lens of identity. Now, I have to say, when we get to these activities, we want to hear what you think. There are no wrong answers. Really, this is a space to share and to build a practice of learning and having these, what can often be difficult conversations. There are no wrong answers, but we want to hear what you think. So with that, I'm going to dive into the first section, that first lens of identity. So really, we're talking about the United States, and I cannot talk about the United States and representation without talking about race and ethnicity. You know, one of the most important things for us to really, really understand as we did this work was what does the current demographic makeup of the United States and all of these other countries we're looking at actually look at. And what we understood through our research is that, you know, there are a lot of mix-ups and misrepresentations around race and ethnicity. And I think a lot of that is, you know, the historic nature of how race was constructed and weaponized in this country. You know, the United States is the only country outside of South Africa that actually enshrined race into law. And those races were white, Black, and Native American. It wasn't called that at the time, but, you know, white, Black, and Native American. And what became complicated as the country kind of diversified through immigration and through expansion is that there have been complications about what race means and what ethnicity means and how things diversified over time. You know, the reality is that the US is one of the most racially and ethnically diverse countries in the world. And it's increasingly becoming multiracial and polycultural as a lot of different communities, nationalities, and backgrounds are living side by side. What's even more complicated is for the so for communities of color, you know, it isn't just that there is increasing, there's such a rapid growth in terms of communities of color populations that do not identify as white. And within even those categories, for these broad ethnic or racial categories, there's so much diversity. If you think about the Latino population here in the US, for example, there are so many different nationalities that are represented by this population, which means there's different cultures, different ways to speak Spanish. Maybe you're not speaking Spanish at all, maybe you're Brazilian, but also across other you know, nationalities like the Asian population, and even the Black population is the Caribbean and foreign-born and African population are also increasing for Black communities. So there's a lot of even intra-community diversity that need to be reflected. But when we look at the visual landscape, what we are finding are a few things. The first thing is that some communities of color are often emphasized. And so what we found through our research is that, you know, actually in terms of representation, Black and Latino people are being very well represented alongside East Asian and Southeast Asian ethnicities, as well as South Asian ethnicities like Indian and Middle Eastern. And yet Native Americans and Pacific Islanders are often underrepresented compared to their populational proportions. And taking it a step further, because we wanted to look at not just by the numbers, you know, because diversity is one component of it. It is also about inclusion and how people are represented. Another thing that we found was that tokenism, which is kind of this, you know, perfunctory, very symbolic effort at representing. So think about, you know, where you have a multiracial group where, you know, you have different ethnicities and backgrounds all included, and saying, this is my diversity check, you know, done in my ad or in my campaign. You know, there are these habits that are still happening. And so, for example, you know, people of color are more likely to appear in multiracial, multi-ethnic groups than white people are. And even within communities of color, those tendencies tend to increase or decrease. In fact, that you know, Black people are the most likely racial group to actually appear in that multi-ethnic kind of tokenism scenario versus people of Asian descent. And so that was pretty consistent to what we were finding out broadly. And when it came to advertising, that, you know, there's been an increase of visibility, but that increase is pretty symbolic. Another thing that we wanted to look at with much more precision than we ever have before is colorism, because we know this is something that affects all melanated communities around the world. And what we found is that an increased visibility, so you have this heightened representation of a lot of communities of color, but this tendency is still existing toward colorism. And so one example I want to give, I know this is a very dense slide, but this is from the toolkit itself. But one thing to think about is the fact that, you know, for women in Getty's libraries, women actually, and for our customers, women tend to be overrepresented when it comes to the imagery that brands often choose. And yet that number kind of flips, that dynamic gets reversed when you control for skin color. So dark-skinned women tend to be underrepresented, and dark-skinned men tend to be overrepresented. And even when you look at even for age, that lighter-skinned children are more likely to appear than darker-skinned children. So think about my biggest pet peeve is when we see a very, very light-skinned child with a set of dark-skinned parents. That is a dynamic that we can see play out quite a bit in visuals right now. And often this has real world consequences, because we know that people still experience high rates of discrimination based on their skin color. So when we think about, you know, what are those opportunities? What are those things that are missing? You know, it's really about bringing depth, dimension, and specificity, you know, across different communities of color, different spectrums of skin tones, and myriad scenarios. We want to see people of color, especially Black people, especially dark-skinned Black people, especially dark-skinned Black women at work and as leaders in all possible settings and scenarios. Another through line that you're going to see is we want to talk about who's partnered and who's coupled, and those dynamics and how we present partnered folks. Oftentimes you'll see either in an interracial couple, you'll see a white partner, or you'll see a darker skin partner and a lighter skin partner. And if that's the only thing that you see, then that kind of leaves out a lot of different communities. So those are the sort of dynamics that we want to think about in your visuals. And in terms of questions to ask yourself, it's really about, with these experiences in mind, you know, how fully realized are stories of people of color in the visuals that you choose and the campaigns that you might be concepting? You know, are you representing people in a way that diminishes or breaks free from certain stereotypes? And what do you understand about the historic depictions of the communities that you are trying to represent? And what are you actively doing to challenge those stereotypes? And specifically thinking about skin tones and favoring certain skin tones, you know, these are the realities of discrimination for people of color across different ethnicities and backgrounds. You need to make sure you're conscious of including darker skin folks and people of all skin tones in your visuals. And similar to skin tone, and this is especially true for Black people, is to make sure that you're thinking about a range of hair types and textures and styles when you are depicting people of color. And then last but certainly not least, in terms of who, you know, what plays out in visual dynamics, are you taking an expansive view of, you know, all this sort of interests and activities and the roles that people of color, communities of color can play in visuals? Who is at the helm? Who is a leader? Who, you know, what sort of roles are they playing? Who are the teachers, the doctors, engineers, and so on? All right, so I'm going to take a break from talking, and we're going to dive into our first set of exercises. So remember, there are no wrong answers. We want to hear what you really, really think about these questions. So for the first activity, we would love your thoughts on which image A or image B, is most successful at inclusively representing a person of color.
As we're waiting for folks to answer, Nikki would love to hear your thoughts on these images.
Well, I knew you were going to tell me to chime in, Justin, so I came off mute just in time. This is one that while I know there are no right or wrong answers, Tristen, this is one actually that I struggled with the first time I heard it, because I was like, are we trying too hard with image B? And you know, and certainly I know people who bike through the mountains and who bike in what looks to be cold weather, but I was like, are we trying too hard? But then with image A, it feels like we are trying too hard, right? And it's like, oh, let me get one of everything and put them into this picture. So I do have a strong opinion, but since Julian has raised their hand, I'll pause on it and let Julian chime in first.
So I'm just not, I think it's B. I'm not a fan of plain stock images like that. I know it's like a global thing. Everyone uses them. We use them. I get it. But when it comes to inclusivity, I like seeing myself in things that we normally don't do. Like my big example I use for people is like Mission Impossible. Love Mission Impossible. It's amazing. It could easily be fit with any ethnicity and any race. Plenty of people can fit that role of whatever it is. And when it comes to biking, and this image here that I'm looking at, I like that, because it shows me, you know, somebody does do this that is my color and who is Black or Caribbean, whatever it may be. And I just like seeing that we're not still in that box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tristen.
I'm definitely going to reveal myself to not be an outdoorsy person. So I felt like you, I was like, this is trying too hard, and I picked the image. But I totally hear you in that, you know, kind of that just an assortment of pick every color, race, or ethnicity may not necessarily resonate. Sarah, I see you have your hand raised. Love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I really like B as well. My husband's a big cyclist, and so definitely in his races, I see a lot more diversity than there ever was before. So I actually do see that this is an area that people are from all ethnicities are starting to take advantage of. And you know, I really do believe like you can't be what you can't see, right? And so like the winner of the Tour de France last year was Colombian, and that's really unusual. And so being able to see like that this is available, this is something that's really pleasurable for everyone. I think it's a beautiful image.
Thanks, Sarah. So I hear 2 for B. I think I'd love someone to really fight the fight for image A. Tiffany, I see your hand raised both physically and on the Zoom. Hi.
Hi, I definitely did want to comment on A. So I work in pharmaceutical healthcare. So for me, when I'm looking at inclusive imagery, I'm looking at a couple of different things. So if A was, for instance, an ad for a dermatology condition, I would want to see all different types of skin colors, because very often what happens in our industry is we will only see dermatology conditions on pale skin. So for me, from that perspective, A, if I'm using it for something like that, is far more inclusive than just showing B.
Yes, this is where context matters. It depends on your industry. It depends on what you're doing. It depends on what you're presenting. So it's an excellent, excellent point. I mean, you do have a good range of even gradation in the different skin tones and also different backgrounds, which I think, you know, and another thing that I like about it, and I know this is a little bit what we call like a classic, very portrait. But I think the styling also feels nice and it feels more relaxed. And I think that they could work in a lot of different contexts, but still feel very contemporary and fresh. Often you have to like really be super neutral. So yes, context matters. So with that, I'm gonna have to move. I've just muted myself, sorry. Do you agree with the following statement? Is this an appropriate and authentic representation of this lens of identity?
So yeah, you should be getting a poll now that just popped up if everyone wants to answer.
Yep, we got the poll.
And Tristen, I know we're on to the next exercise, but it looks like about 80% of you voted on the last poll. Thank you. And yeah, super interesting. So thanks for the energy. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Nikki.
Yeah, no, this one, I love this image. I love how intersectional this image is. It just feels for me like it's in the moment and authentic and showing, you know, real life and doesn't feel contrived at all, while also, as I said, really highlighting the intersectionality of the talent in the photo. And I know Delbert raised their hand on the prior poll, but I didn't know if you also have a comment around this one. Would love to give you a chance to chime in first.
Thank you so much. And I'd rather comment on the last one if that's possible.
Okay.
So I'm a Black man who identifies as African, right? Born in the United States. So this is my reflection. My lived experience says that terms like people of color and diversity are triggering terms for me, because my lived experience is I get marginalized in those boxes. So when you talk about a representation, what I'm growing towards is using language like Black and people of color. So we make sure that we center Blackness as being intentional. That's what I want to share about the last slide.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I don't want to get us off topic because I have a comment. If we have time at the end, I'd like to follow up on that.
Yeah, thanks for your feedback on that.
Yeah, that was great.
Any comments on this particular image? I think we only
Like
we've got a few hands raised.
Crystal, if you want to go off in.
Yes, thank you. Okay, immediately I said yes, because it feels like an authentic representation. Of course, it doesn't represent everyone, but it is an authentic representation, in my opinion. And how I deciphered that was like literally just going to the center of the portrait, and their hands are like overlapped, right? So it's like very intimate, they're close, they're both laughing. It just seems really real to me. So yeah, it's an immediate yes for me.
Thank you so much. Do we have the results yet, Justin?
Yes.
Overwhelmingly, folks agree then. It's great. Thank you so much.
Can I chime in from like the devil's advocate, the no? While I felt this image was an authentic representation in many aspects, thinking about what seems to be some younger folk, what didn't feel authentic was their fashion choices. You know, this feels like something that could have been a wardrobe selection maybe 20 years ago, and it just didn't feel authentic to today's youth. It's maybe like authentic if they were going to participate in a family portrait where everyone, we've all seen those family portraits where everyone's wearing the same thing. But that's where this image began to fall apart from an authenticity standpoint. It felt like, okay, this is an ad and we're trying not to show any brands. So this will be safe from a wardrobe perspective.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment, and thank you for that. I mean, these are, and what I do know about this particular image is that these are the talent's own clothing. And this was only in the last, I believe, 2 years or so, and this is down in Atlanta. And they're a real queer couple. At the same time, I do think that sometimes when you have with these images, they can read kind of very staged and posed if it's too matchy, and also might not necessarily sort of resonate, or kind of the things that come across when you see a visual and you don't have any of that context. We have time for one last comment and then or question. I do not know the order, so Nikki or Justin.
Yeah, it looks like Nyla was next on the list. So Nyla, if you want to go off mute.
Great, thanks.
I am. I'm so glad. Thank you so much, and I appreciate both Citi and ADCOLOR and Getty for providing this. I think it's so important. I think that the instruction in the first few slides that you gave is so important in terms of understanding and navigating the nuances, right? The spectrum of diversity and identity. And I think that's so incredibly important. My question, and I think it's really possible that you guys may cover this later on about both of these images and about the slides that we've seen so far, and you may be covering this later, is if we're going to talk about appropriate and authentic representation, are we covering genuine and organically sourced authentic representation? Meaning, if we're going to front face diversity, are we then supporting the communities that we're actually representing? So are you guys, is part of this, so as part of this campaign to not only present what looks like diversity, but then to also incorporate that into corporate ethos? So I think that would be my question. Are these images sourced from people who are of diverse makeup and different identity, or is this a dominant culture campaign to show us but not be of us, is my question.
Thanks, Nyla, for that question. And you bring up a good point. It seems like a point about equity, the equity equation of diversity and inclusion. This image comes from Getty Images library, and the content creators behind it are, I can check, but I'm pretty sure this content creator is, forgive me for using this language, but a person of color, but I do not know their exact background. Regardless, part of this, our work and our commitment at Getty Images is to also invest in the communities that we are trying to reflect. And so making sure that we're providing funding, making sure that we're for content creators who come from underrepresented and or marginalized backgrounds. And that work we've been doing through our grant programs, that work we've been doing through our collection content creation. And also this campaign that we're doing with Citi is kind of helping also on the front end, make sure that we bring that visibility and representation of those communities to the forefront as well. So I can't speak for Citi's work investment, but I know Nikki and the Citi team are doing a lot of also work in terms of equity.
Yeah, we've got a significant focus on increasing not just sort of our marketing and what we are projecting into the world, but how we are using our broader platform, which comes down to dollars, to support diverse communities. And again, in the interest of time, I won't go into much detail, but I would love to invite anybody to check out what we call our Action for Racial Equity on citigroup.com. And I know this isn't supposed to be a plug, but and it'll walk you through sort of the pillars and the work that we're doing within our financial commitment that we've made that exceeds $1 billion for the Black community and how we are working to build equity. I will say that this work is one of the things that, you know, we have done to help fulfill that commitment because one of the pillars is around anti-racist practices in our businesses. And so in order to equip our marketers, again, to be more inclusive in how we are showing the world, this is one of those deliverables, but it goes way. This is a tiny part of what mostly hinges on real dollars that we're committing and are actually distributing. So I invite you to take a look at that work. Tristen, should we move to the next?
Yeah, thank you so much. So before we dive into this section, which I have to speed through just because we are running a little bit behind on time, I do want to call out that within the toolkit itself, we do separate sexual orientation from gender identity. We know that the LGBTQ acronym combines and looks at both. So for the purposes of this section, for the most part, with the exception of the background and the demographic landscape, we are only looking at LGBTQ plus identities, so identities related to sexual orientation rather than gender identity. So in terms of sexual orientation, what we have is that, you know, we do know that increasingly, and I think this is due in large part into just the changing sociocultural landscape and also younger generations being more out and proud, is that people are increasingly identifying as LGBTQ+. In total, they make up about 15% of the population, and, you know, becoming increasingly more visible in media and television. And while there's a growth in the number of LGBTQ people raising children, only 29% are actually parents. And I want you to keep that number in mind when I talk about the next section. Because when we look at the actual visual landscape, one of the things is that we identified is that even in spite of all of this visibility in terms of other forms of media, there's low visibility in terms of visuals in marketing and advertising. And of those visuals that are included, they're often stereotypical. So 70% of visuals related to featuring someone who identifies as LGBTQ+ are related to couples and family structures. And then overwhelmingly, the community is being shown in lifestyle content, so everyday living, but not at business, school, and travel settings, which are areas where often increasingly they experience discrimination, and we know centering them there is incredibly important. Additionally, you know, when we look at intersectionality, to Nikki's point earlier, and that is that, you know, what we find is that they're not always intersectional. You know, there are certain communities that are non-white or communities of color who are overrepresented, and there are certain communities that are underrepresented. So, and then there are also a lot of interracial relationships when it comes to depicting the queer community, and they're most likely to show a white partner and a non-white partner versus partners of all ethnicities and races. And there's very little representation of people with disabilities, people who are trans and gender nonconforming, and also identify as LGBTQ+, as well as they're often being shown as very overwhelmingly young. So when we think about what we're missing is, again, going back to dimension and really showing the community a variety of different settings and, you know, all sorts of backgrounds, whether it's race or ethnicity, as well as, you know, disability, looking at different types of relationship structure, looking at showing people in the workplace, and just, again, underscoring the importance of separating sexuality. Oftentimes we show sexuality from gender identity, because oftentimes we default still when showing trans and gender nonconforming people to kind of very heteronormative structures in terms of the relationships that they might have. So when you ask yourself questions as you make the choices that you're making, it's really, what are the scenarios that LGBTQ plus people commonly appear in? What questions and what roles are they playing? How are you showing them living positive and fulfilling lives? We often find that there's either kind of relationships or being shown, or there are flags and very one-dimensional depictions. And then are you showing LGBTQ plus people of various races and ethnicities? There's been an avatar for the queer community, and he's usually white, cisgender, and gay, and not necessarily showing any dimension beyond that. And finally, are you showing LGBTQ plus people of all ages? Because we know that there are a lot of different people of all ages and backgrounds who exist as part of the community. So let's really dive in to the exercises, because I know y'all love this. We spent a lot of time on the last set of exercises, and I'd love to hear thoughts, questions, opinions on this next set of exercises. So which image do you see as most inclusively representing the community? And again, considering all the learnings, considering everything we put forward, again, no wrong answers, but would love to hear thoughts and opinions. And if anyone wants to come off mute to weigh in, I know there was a long line for the last section.
So Iman still has their hand up. I don't know if you have an opinion on this one.
Oh, thanks for calling on me. I actually was raising it for the last one. I didn't realize it was still up. No, not ready to form an opinion on this one. Still taking it in.
Okay, no worries. We'll go to Olympia.
Hi, I absolutely am going to be saying B, because our agency does a great deal of pride campaigns and LGBTQ platforms for 365. The one on the left is almost like constant you see out there, and it's only for June, and it is definitely the kind of like, there's the flag. The one on the right is so much more emotional. It's so much more human. And again, it's also the forgotten set. And I feel like this is so strong because of, gay males who are of a certain age, as they're entering like their final years. This is really like, extremely heartfelt. And I just really, all the way B. The one on the left is just, I see it all the time. And I would just say you could definitely make more of an impact. And people, relate to a couple who have been together for many years. And that is actually more of also the community's mission too, to understand like people's journeys throughout life. It's not just always with the youth. Pride is for all ages at all stages of life. So.
Thanks, Olympia. Lindsay, hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Tristen.
Question, comment?
Yeah, so I guess this is a question or a thought I had, and this is maybe a stupid question or a thought, but because there is such a diversity in the way that queer folks represent themselves visually, there's not always a clear visual marker that indicates that that person's sexual orientation is not straight. So I guess the question is it just context? Because I think B is obviously, to me, more inclusively representing the community. But I think if you look at it in a vacuum without any additional information, it's not, I guess, immediately clear to me that those men are LGBTQ. So just a question, see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and this is a question we get quite frequently because it's hard to really know without a lot of what we hear a lot of the time. It's hard to know if you don't have certain signals or cues. I think it requires us to kind of challenge what we are doing on the back end as well. And so one of the things that Getty has kind of shifted toward in the last maybe 10 years is really casting and focusing on casting real people. And so we are trying to make sure that we have, and we did a lot of this work through our work on Project Show Us, where we were creating content that featured women and non-binary folks photographed by women and non-binary folks. And so we made our contributors have a lot of conversations with the talent, with the real people that they were casting in their shoots, so that at the very least we can start verifying that these are real queer people, and that that even if you are searching for, regardless of the scenarios, you are searching for LGBTQ content on our site, that you can find and surface that content. But we're gonna have to change our brains. I think we're still in the early days. We're still changing kind of culture there. So it's gonna be hard for now, but what we're trying to do is create that content and make it available, making sure we authentically at least include queer people at the center.
Awesome, thank you.
And if we could call on Carol. Carol, I see Carol's my colleague. I see her hand raised, and I have a feeling her comment is about the tagging, just because I know Carol.
Oh my goodness, I raised my hand. It was somewhat accidental, but it's okay. No, this is all wonderful. I really, like I said, I sort of accidentally did it, but it's really nice to see all this. And I think the big thing on a tagging front is looking at the picture and trying to define what you actually want to tag, especially when it comes to race and ethnicity. Because as you said, in different regions, different people use different terms, different things. Some things are considered insulting, some aren't. And so, I think that's something we have to think about when we're putting these in systems for people to be able to find them.
Yeah, thank you. Carol manages our digital asset manager, so our platform. So I had a feeling that might be the topic. Should we go to the next?
Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks, Carol. I think we're going to maybe, Nikki, maybe skip the second exercise and go on to disability.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Great. All right. And so our last exercise, our last lens of identity that we're going to be looking at is really often the forgotten lens of identity. When it comes to advertising, it is the forgotten D in DE&I, and it really is disability. This is one of the largest groups in the world, and especially in the United States, 61 million adults are living with some sort of disability. And we are missing out often as an industry on a big part of that community. But we're also becoming, I think, what the heartening thing is that we're having more and more conversations, not just about the numbers, representation by the numbers, but also accessibility, especially because, you have a generation who grew up when the post the ADA and have these higher standards for accessibility and inclusion. When we looked at the visual landscape, one of the things that we found is that, representation, as with the queer community, representation with people with disabilities were very, very low overall. And even when they were included, what we saw was kind of these really clear habits in terms of who gets to be centered. So really focusing on physical disability over, intellectual or developmental disabilities. And also the scenarios and the settings, going back to the point where context matters, a lot of those visuals were showing them in positions and receiving care rather than being independent, autonomous, and doing leisure activities or being in love or being around their friends or within their community. And then again, intersectionality is kind of a through line for us, of just thinking about all the ways identities overlap and intersect. And what we found was that, there is a lot of underrepresentation of defaulting to only showing white people with disabilities, as well, especially for underrepresenting the Native American community. There's a high prevalence of disabilities within that community, and yet they're very, very underrepresented. And also overrepresenting seniors and really showing them as mostly elderly and infirm, rather than showing seniors with disabilities who might have a disability but can get around pretty capable. And those has real world consequences because people experience high rates of discrimination. And so a couple of things that are missing are, thinking about, again, dimension and bringing different types of disabilities to the center, really intentional, authentic casting. This is another one where with invisible disabilities in particular, you are making sure to cast someone who has that particular disability, and not have a non-disabled person act out having a particular disability in a really stereotypical way, showing people with chronic illness and who may be deaf or autistic or low vision, things like that. And all, again, intersectional, all sexualities and backgrounds. Last couple of thought starters, questions when you are making your choices. This is so very important for people with disabilities, and making sure that we are thinking about the camera angle and we're not tilting downward, or we're not, even in terms of the aesthetic choices of, sometimes there's like kind of making, overlaying certain graphics to make the person who's disabled seem like a superhero, things like that. It's historically really, incredibly important to really show just natural, beautiful, empowered, authentic. And making sure that you're focusing on a person's whole identity. What do they do? What do they do for a living? What friends and what are the hobbies or interests? And making sure you show a lot of different ranges and experiences. These are two cyclists who do tandem biking because they have low vision, for example. And so this is, the real experiences, real lives. And then last, representing multiple intersections of identity. This is from a full shoot where she is Moroccan, is also trans and also deaf. And in other imagery, you can see her hearing aid. And so making sure that you are thinking about all ways that identity can overlap and intersect. So I'm gonna actually do the second activity, since we didn't get to do the second activity the last round, and we'll do our last activity of the day. If you agree with the following statement, do you think that this is an appropriate and authentic representation of this lens of identity?
Can I ask a question while we're doing this about the last image that you showed of the trans deaf woman? And I'm sorry, there was something else you mentioned.
Yep, okay. No, that was it. And she's Moroccan as well, of Moroccan descent.
Thank you, Moroccan. Okay, so here's my question about that. I would not know about any kind of disability or her sexual orientation from that image. And maybe there's more to that image than we saw on the screen. But I guess my question is, how would anyone know that's being represented from that image? Do you know what I mean? Is it more just choosing talent and being inclusive in your casting? Is that what you're getting at, or?
Yes, exactly. I think it's a mindset change. I think in the industry mindset change, we often over rely, and we've done this for all communities. We're going to rely on some stereotypes to signal that we are down. Like they did a lot for Black advertising in the 70s and 80s, where they were like, we need to have, or even the 90s, hip hop jingle so that that we're talking to Black people. And similarly for the queer community, for example, they will have a rainbow flag and all these tropes. I think we have to break out of that, and it's a little bit uncomfortable because we're not relying, we might not know at the top that this is that person's lived experience. At the same time, I also think when you are doing those casting conversations, you might be having conversations with what do you really do? What your community is like, how do you spend your days? And some of that will come out actually and come through the visual that you choose, but you got to get comfortable with it not being a little bit more subtle. And what we're trying to do, at the very least, is make that content more readily available.
Thank you for the clarification. That's super helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I do think, though, depending on context, you can decide whether you think it's important for there to be some kind of signal. And I think in the cases where there is a reason where it's important for people to know something about the person's identity, we have to be thoughtful as to how we're doing that, right? So to Tristen's point, maybe not a rainbow flag. And so, but I think the primary point is, let's think about the casting and not necessarily about those outward signals. And are there other ways, scenarios, situations, broader context that can help tell the story?
Right. So copy can change a lot of things. You know, if it's a full video, it can also change a lot of things. And so again, these are not exhaustive. These are just starting points for you to think about the choices that you're making in your work. I have time for one more question, comment before we wrap.
Maeve is first.
Okay, great. Maeve, you're up. Thank you.
Hi, yes, I think you kind of addressed it a little bit. I was wondering if there was any like recommendation when it comes to alt text or captioning, when it came to like a photo like that, that's not necessarily as apparent the identities that are being shown.
Yeah, and we're working really closely with our search team and also the city teams, I think on their end are also thinking about this as well, to make sure that our contributors know at the outset how to tag, how to be appropriate, how to not share inappropriate tagging. We're also beginning to look at captions as well as something we hadn't looked at in the past. So just making sure for people, contributors of all backgrounds, if English isn't their native language, how can we provide guidance on how to talk about certain communities to be inclusive from captioning, a captioning standpoint as well. We can share a lot of information about that in the follow-up. Thank you. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for the participation. This is such an active discussion. I really, really appreciate the time. I want to pass it over to Nikki to talk about a little bit about what's next in our partnership.
Yeah. Okay. Just had to make sure I was off mute. This was great. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. Obviously, we didn't get through all the questions. You know, I am available, as is Tristen. I'm just going to offer you up on LinkedIn. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer anything that we didn't get to here. We covered a lot. And I think what's important in terms of next steps, and thank you, Tristen, I have to say that first, before I go into what's next, to really, for taking us through this. Tristen is like my new partner in crime, my ride or die. We are on the road doing these things anyway, sometimes in person. And I always value what you bring to the table and your insights so much. So, you know, as we're putting this into action, I think the most important thing is that you check out the toolkits. US, Mexico, and UK, like I said, are live right now at the QR code that's at the bottom of not this screen, but all the other ones. So I hope you grabbed it. Okay. And, you know, we're going to be rolling out a number of additional countries across the next few months. Next up is Singapore, India, UAE, in that order, I believe. And then, of course, we've got many, many more. So please download, stay connected, so that for any of you who are working across countries and cultures, you can glean from all those different insights that are gathered and represented in the toolkit. And of course, let's continue the conversation. I think this is rich and robust for all of us. And I think I learn something new every time I have these conversations, and this group has certainly brought some additional things to the forefront for us to really think about as we continue this work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Anna, anything else from you, or are we good to go?
No, just thank you so much for sharing this with us. It's super valuable, great conversation. I will be sending out an email with the link to the toolkit here shortly for those who attended. So if you didn't hit that QR code, don't worry, you'll get it. It'll also include a survey. Let us know what you thought. We want to keep offering these amazing resources and tools to you. So let us know what we can do better. And thank you again for participating.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.